Good evening. The writers of the West take for granted certain basic freedoms. Above all, to say what they like, how they like. They assume that once those essentials of creative liberty are lost, there's little chance of freshness or innovation or even artistic truth. Yet gradually, God knows very gradually in England, we're coming to realize that work is being done in repressive societies, in Soviet Russia and Eastern Europe, in South America and South Africa, which is at least as powerful and new as anything that most of the poets and novelists in the West can manage. Now, does this say something about the perverse nature of creativity or about its irrepressibility? Or does it imply that those precarious liberal values we set so much store on are not always as vital as we imagine? George Steiner has strong views on this subject, and with him to argue the question are two distinguished writers. The poet Joseph Brodsky, who was exiled from Russia 10 years ago and now lives in New York, and the American novelist and essayist Mary McCarthy. George Steiner.
Serious in literature try to say no to human stupidity and cruelty and hypocrisy. And the yes which great art and literature say to life, even out of darkness, is by any measure a utopian, a revolutionary yes. It presses upon our imagination, upon our understanding, an active hope, an active dream of change. This is why serious art and literature have been the concern of the state from the start of recorded history and have often been manipulated by the state. If we think for a moment, Egypt, ancient Sumer, the Oriental empires, there was only official art. And Plato in the Republic declares that to change the modes of music is to touch at the foundations of the state itself. Now, in Russian history, from Byzantium to the Tsars, from the Tsars to the totalitarian present, censorship has been the indivisible shadow on all literature. The development of poetry, of prose in Russian, is virtually a history of unbroken persecution, suppression, exile, and murder. You can't think of a great Russian writer, of a major Russian figure, Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, or Pasternak, or Solzhenitsyn, who has not, in his work or in his personal life, suffered harassment, exile, or worse. And since the early 1920s, the record is one of unparalleled efficiency of bestiality. Now, there are other bureaucracies of falsification and persecution. They operate today not only in the Soviet satellites throughout Eastern Europe, but as we know in South Africa, in the junta fiefs which now brutalize so much of Latin America. The artist, the writer, he is dealt with as if he were the most dangerous of opponents. Now, in the free world, in what we call the free world, by contrast, he is fantastically privileged, as we are who are his audience. But is the work produced in the relative Eden of our free world manifestly more imaginative, more spacious, more humane than that being turned out under the whip or in the claustrophobic shadows of the underground? One would expect the writer in the West to take precisely those risks of moral and imaginative depths, those quantum jumps of moral challenge, which at mortal peril are denied to what the great Polish exiled poet and writer Czesław Miłosz has called the mind in chains. I don't want to argue statistics or recite catalogues of writers, or to say exactly what has been, what is being written, where, though I imagine we will have to name writers in our discussion. Let me put my hunch quite boldly and vulnerably. It does seem to me that the major writing in our current scene, the poems and novels which, as Kafka said, you just can't do without, are being turned out in the Soviet bloc, in Latin America, in South Africa, and not in the free world, except perhaps for one strange little bit under some censorship and full of violence, namely Ireland. Now, is there any explanation for this kind of paradox? Two reasons are usually given. Which might explain why so much is second-rate on our side. One goes back a very long way. Artists do well under pressure and adversity. You remember James Joyce says, we are olives, squeeze us. The artist works for a great proportion of the time against the body politic, and much of the best art, much of the best literature which we know, does seem to have been produced under rather despotic control in Periclean Athens, in the Florence of the Medicis, in Elizabethan England, in the Versailles of the Roi Soleil, or in the autocratic, princely, brutal little states of Germany. Suggestively, de Tocqueville once said he wasn't sure at all that a decent democracy was a natural home for great poetry or artistic excellence. It is by laboring against the bonds, against the expectations of the body politic, that the writer becomes really conscious, fully conscious, both of the burden and the enormous privilege of his mysterious calling. Urged to leave Argentina, where he is in great danger today, Borges said, "No, I won't leave, because censorship is the mother of metaphor." But there's a second possible reason, and it's one which I think really concerns us here tonight very deeply. Hideous as they are, the pressures on the writer under political censorship and persecution do often seem to stimulate, to compel what is best in him. Could it be that the writer in the West is also under pressure, but that the pressures on our side in some way diminish, trivialize, dissipate his gifts? During the showing on American television of Holocaust, advertisements interrupted the actual film at regular, very brief intervals. They included advertisements for pantyhose and detergents shown between scenes of torture and suffocation in the gas ovens. In a magazine section of an English Sunday paper, esteemed for its appeal to the literate part of the public, we witnessed a leading English philosopher modeling men's clothes on the elegant roof of his college, and so on and on ad infinitum. I admit to sensing that these degradations are, properly speaking, enormities. They enact a trivialization, if not a destruction, of basic categories, of basic values of perception. Yet I sense also that the moment I say that, many in the audience will say, it's grossly exaggerated, you're being melodramatic. Look, it doesn't really matter, does it? That's my point, of course. That's what I'm asking. What happens to art, to literature, where, when it doesn't really matter? When almost all can be said, what's saying is essential. Very little indeed in the Western dispensation just now lies outside the reach of media package and the solicitations of the big money. It is not only the vacuum of license which makes it so very difficult for the Western writer to achieve certain dimensions, certain indispensabilities to man. It is the extension, perhaps inherently democratic, to every aesthetic and intellectual area of the criteria of the marketplace and of the amusement arcade. The fearsome paradox is this: the KGB censor, the vicious little thugs in big boots who run Argentina or South Africa know that a poem by Pasternak, a novel by Nadine Gordimer, a parable by Borges are the most dynamic, potentially subversive of all human enterprises. They know that man, in the last analysis, lives by ideas and the obsessions of thought. It is this perilous centrality which societies of mass consumption and of ratings find absurd or frankly inadmissible. Does this not put upon us, I think, a very special obligation? Aware as we are of the horrible conditions under which men and women in the hemisphere of the Gulag or the junta world are producing their work, are enduring, are thinking, knowing as we do how much we owe to the work, to the great literature which they are producing, ought we not to look more sharply at the indecencies of trivialization, of vulgarization, indeed of outright contempt, which now reach so very deeply into our own creative condition?
Well, thank you, George Steiner. Now, I wonder if I could have a very brief reaction from both you, Mary, and from you, Joseph. Mary.
Well, 2 points. I will be brief. Your finale, George, really makes me think of the way when I was a child, people tried to make you eat, finish what was on your plate. They'd say, think of the starving Armenians, and you were supposed to eat, thinking of the starving Armenians. You want us to do something equivalent, finish what's on our plate. The other thing, George, more seriously, is that I think there's some truth in what you say, particularly about the effect of censorship, the pressure it puts on in the East, in the junta countries, which I know much less about. But I think you make your case impossible by exaggeration and by a certain sort of mechanistic view of the creation of art. You really have taken, I seem to recognize, Edmund Wilson's old Wound in the Bow, brought up to date and politicized. This assumes the idea of the wound in the bow was that, based on the Philoctetes legend, was that the gifted writer or gifted artist suffered an incurable wound, and in return for it he received a bow. Now, this always, even in Wilson's version, seemed to me much too mechanistic a notion of the process of creation, which seems to me is a mystery, and that's what you seem to be, I think, not purposely trying to take out of it, the mystery.
Thank you. Joseph, what about you?
Well, I have more than two things, but I'll just limit myself to two. In the first place, I think simply freedom is the greatest masterpiece of all. That is, and it's, in a sense, in its own turn, it's a kind of a result of all these artistic efforts of writers, etc., etc. So, if I understand you properly, the situation that arises from what you're saying is that, yeah, it's true that under the systems of political oppression, the art sometimes functions in a more active fashion. But simply as a human being and not as a writer, the first thing I would say that if you give me a choice between, let's say, democracy and Solzhenitsyn, I say democracy. The second thing is, well, it's closely linked to what Mary said about the artistic process being a mystery, because art, literature, in fact, you said that it's from the beginning it was an official literature. Well, it's both true and not exactly true, because even speaking of the Egyptian literature, basically, art, especially the art of letters, starts with poetry. I think poetry precedes somehow prose, and a poet, in a sense like a bird, starts to chirp on no matter what kind of a branch he alights on. Yeah, it's in other words, what I'm trying to say is that literature is much more is a much older and more inevitable phenomenon than any state, and it's going to be that way.
Well, could we now then take up these various points? Let's start with this mechanistic view. I'm sure you have some response to that, George.
I think one can greatly exaggerate the mystique of the mystery. There is a tremendous mystery. But for instance, when we take some of the absolute masters of literature, for example, they wrote to commission, and they wrote in highly professional circumstances, and the circumstances of an autocratic court like Versailles, which commissioned Racine to write great plays, are worth comparing with the supermarket circumstances of a totally open, infinite chance of commissioning, which in so much of the West today is producing trash, is producing kitsch and trash of every kind. So that I think the fascinating problem is that the professionalism of great art, and I think even very great art, is highly professional in many respects. God knows Shakespeare and his fellow dramatists and the circumstances of the most menacing censorship, within which framework, given that you will always have frameworks, always have constraints in every society, in every practical complex of human beings, which seem to produce in the artist the greater sense of his own essential indispensability. I just do want to leave the Kafka words on the table, the kind of poem and novel one cannot do without.
But trash is trash, George, through the centuries. I, for my sins, at one period, a long, long time ago, when you and I, in fact, first knew each other, did a lot of research on that great period of English literature, the Elizabethan, early Jacobean period. And the 98% of it is totally unreadable. There just happened to be a lot of very great poets around. The trash isn't going to be stopped by anything.
And if you're going to
you haven't answered my question about cause and effect. You assume a causal relation, which I think either may not exist at all, or if it does exist, cannot really be so readily determined as you pretend in this argument. I don't think you really think that.
I would go along. Of course, it is not a simple mechanistic circumstance, but I would, of course, throw back at you the question, in that case, do you have any kind of working hypothesis to explain the feebleness of so much on the one side of the world, and the paradoxical power and excellence of so much that is coming out where one wouldn't expect it? That's a question one has a right to ask.
Well, let me answer the second part first. I don't think that, to my knowledge, right now, coming out of the Soviet Union or even out of Eastern Europe, which are areas I know, and I can't talk about the others much. In any case, I think there was a really great period that ended perhaps, 10 years ago, if not longer. And to my knowledge, there's nothing so tremendous that we have to bow down in shame before it.
Certainly not. In the first place, well, getting back to what Al was saying about the trash, that is actually what you started to talk about. Well, if you compare literatures, well, in that kind of a general eagle-like view, kind of birds-like view, well, you ought to talk not only about the summits, about the top of the crop, but also, well, you make the comparisons actually from the zero. Yeah, and I think in terms of trash, in terms of zero, non-quality literature, I think well, I can speak quite soundly for the situation in the Soviet letters. Well, I think we are superior to you in that. Well, that is, the East is superior to the West in terms of trash. Yeah,
you mean
that is
more of it.
Yeah. Pardon? Yeah.
More,
Well, I think the Soviet. Yeah. Well, it's simply, well, you have simply basically entertaining, no consequence things, whereas what we have something absolutely unreadable. Yeah. Well, and that's this is one thing. Secondly, well, to more. Well, I would like to simply to address this not exactly the mystery of the creative process, but. Well, I think that the greatest things, the greatest achievements in art, in literature, in this century, to say the least, came, well, I think, I'm afraid to say that, well, took place in the West. Well, you had Proust. Yeah, we didn't have, nowhere in the East, you had anything of, that would match that. Well, and, well, I don't really know, well, I'm not so eager to cite Joyce, merely because, well, he's perfectly comprehensible today, 20 years old, yeah? Well, or you had Beckett, and again, we didn't have anything to match Beckett.
And Beckett is still with us. Before one knocks Western literature too much, we have Beckett.
When we were chatting about this program, we had felt we wanted to avoid catalogues of names. And I
but
think
that's inevitable.
it's very difficult to do. And to take up Joseph's point on his own home ground, forgive my impertinence, but I simply think this is not so, and the facts are totally against you, because from Akhmatova and Tsvetaeva to one Joseph Brodsky,
well, he's living.
Yeah, I'm around,
from them it has been an across-Mandelstam, whom I would put above anyone else except possibly Paul Celan as the very greatest in our time. Celan coming out of the death camp.
What about Rilke?
I would. There are very few one can put anywhere near the unbroken tradition of very great Russian poetry, which has, in this century,
but George, well, that great,
been unbroken.
Those great Russian poets, that is, well, Tsvetaeva, Mandelstam, Akhmatova, Pasternak, they made their mark in Russian poetry long before any substantial oppression took place, that is, before 1917. Their first books, they won their recognition, and very substantial recognition, prior to the revolution, and my hunch is that they would, well, it's certainly a matter of conjecture, etc., but my hunch is that they would become great poets no matter what, oppression or not oppression, history or not history. A great writer, in fact, doesn't need history.
That, I think, is an extremely vast and challenging proposition.
Well,
I can't believe it for a moment, because the very Proust whom you named and the Kafka whom I would name needed history at every point.
A writer
needs a history of taste and a history of sensibility.
I think
above anything else.
I think a writer who has to negotiate every morning when he gets out of bed with his society or with his context the essential privilege of his calling, or whatever you want to call it, or the fact that it's an enormously important
And
thing to
even
do.
if
You don't negotiate with society, you negotiate with the black